The projects that I was doing in Chicago, let's say they were born because nobody in the art world was interested in my art yet. I decided that I would buy a building and kind of renovate it as a way of just keeping myself busy with my own practice and kind of building a site-specific practice where I was living, right? Now, these are site-specific work. This might be a buzzword for artists. It might be a new thing for you. But what it means is that I was willing to first invest all of my time and energy and money at home, and then kind of call this a project or a practice. And in that practice, it would be kind of a platform that I would rehab the building and then make the building available for things to happen. And so what happened was that my creative activity was growing at the same time that my hunger to start to create change in my neighborhood was growing. That I became super interested in ways that I could use this kind of creative lens to kind of make things more beautiful back around the block. But it also meant that I was starting to learn the language of development. I was starting to understand how financing worked, and I was bumping my head up against what the city processes were. I was figuring out who were the other developers doing cool things, and in some cases I was partnering with developers to try to do larger projects. As we would gut a building, I would find myself with these excess materials, and those materials would become part of the poetry of my artwork. Those artworks would be sold, and I would find myself with discretionary cash, and that cash would be the cash that I would use to infuse the block. So I found myself with a slightly circular model, but I was also able to export the story of Dorchester all over the world. Every once in a while, I'll punctuate this talk with like an artwork, but the artwork is usually related to a space. In this case, we're looking at a former hardware store that was on 93rd in Halsted on the south side of Chicago. I bought the building about four or 5 years ago, and the building owner was an Indian gentleman who was ready to retire. What he told me was that the hardware store had become a kind of hub of its own. So, you know, in the morning, mom could leave her keys there, and her kids could pick up the keys when they got out of school. Mail would be sent there. You know, people would hang out there. And actually, it wasn't functioning really as a hardware store anymore. It was just a cultural hub. I was like, all right, that's cool. People weren't buying the stuff. So I took all the stuff, brought it to my studio, and decided that I would recolor code the stuff, and that I would create this kind of like color form, from light colors to dark colors. And in the middle of this project, I decided that I would ship it to the Prada Foundation in Milan. I was asked to do an exhibition there, and I thought I would do an exhibition called True Value, where I kind of used the hardware store to talk about the disappearance of small retail spaces around the country. When Miss Prada found out about the project, she then introduced me to the hardware store families in Milan. So here I am trading tool stories with a 78-year-old Milanese who didn't speak English. And we were just talking about like screwdrivers and light switches, you know, and talking about the differences over the decades and like how light bulbs changed in Italy. It was amazing. But I think in some ways, this hardware store project also functions a little bit like an archive, and is also a testament of like what can happen with these things in the neighborhood when one, let's say one retail project fails. Could it become an amazing artistic project? And in this case, I'm quite proud of True Value. But I've been trying to use these materials to then kind of talk about what it means to understand sacred space and maybe understand development in terms of sacred space. Like, is it possible that the south side of Chicago or the challenged neighborhoods in your cities, is it possible that they're formally sacred spaces that have just kind of lost that sacred power. And in the same way that I was saying in the video that our neighborhoods are not dead, is it possible that there's just all of this amazing spiritual life waiting to be unearthed, but it requires that somebody understands how to do the conjuring. Ultimately, it took us about 2 years maybe to complete the building, but on the front end, we didn't know. There were a lot of things that were kind of underdetermined. We knew that we wanted the space to be a cultural space. We knew that there was some anchor activity that we wanted to use, and I also knew that I would probably have to be one of the primary tenants in order to kind of fund the project. All of those things sounded fine because I felt the South Side deserved a cultural space, a space where people could convene, and the bank was one of the few amazing buildings that could allow that to happen. One of the things that I feel really challenged by is that when we build, or when I'm building, I often don't know the final use of the thing. That I'm super excited to say, this building is important, and over time I'll figure out the use. But I understand that not everybody has the luxury to build like that. But I do think that in large developments where you're talking about 400,000 square feet or 1 million square feet or 2 square miles, like huge redevelopments, the thing that we plan for are the national chains. Like, all right, we want a Chipotle because Chipotle pays really well. We want a Verizon. We want a, and you're planning these things because you're thinking about the rents, but we're often planning without thinking about people's needs. So I'm trying to find ways to do that. But when you look at the library and you come into the space, this is so much more impressive than 4 tiny shops. And I think that in some cases, the Black South Side just needed moments that were simply beautiful, and that they were beautiful for the people who already lived there. Now I understand that with development, sometimes it's, when you create a cultural amenity like this, you probably also need to think a lot about kind of what happens adjacent to it. And I think people started to be attracted to the South Side again and to this neighborhood because there was this kind of free cultural asset that lived right in their neighborhood. The other reason I would say that I'm not a developer is because I'm a little bit, I'm interested in a lot of things. I kind of like big problems. And one of the big problems we had in Chicago was that this emerald ash beetle, this little bugger, right, was eating up all the sap and killing the trees. And Chicago found itself with a problem of about 90,000 trees that had to be felled as a result of this beetle infestation. And so I talk a lot about kind of the call that I got to kind of make art with the trees. But I really thought that the better use of these trees was that it would become millable timber. And that for the ash beetle, the beetle is only interested in the layers between the bark and the tree itself, the sap. It's not interested in the wood, and so the wood was in perfect condition. So we had some empty lots. We asked the city if they would consider dumping trees there, and before I knew it, I had 3,000 trees on my lot, which was awesome. It was such an amazing gift from the city of Chicago. Thank you again, city of Chicago. Right? And we bought a mill. With some support from the Ford Foundation, we were able to buy this amazing mill. And we found ourselves, with a miller, and then we were in the milling racket. We found ourselves competing with other millers. There were only 2 others in the city, and doing a pretty good job of it.